video. So why does this matter? Well, so you got like 7 witnesses. Well, that's not very convincing. Here's the problem. Number one, the Bible is a collection. There aren't that many first-hand accounts outside of the Bible, except for really hostile ones, because the Bible itself is presenting the story of Christ from people who saw him. And so whenever they came across somebody who knew Jesus, who wrote about him, they put it in the Bible. And so you don't have a whole lot of other stuff that's floating around saying, well, Jesus was actually, he was actually a woman, and, that stuff's not around because, like, anybody who talked about Jesus, their books ended up in the Bible. They gathered all that stuff together on purpose. And so what we have is all of the evidence gathered together into a book that presents the case for the life of Jesus. So we have, again, 7 eyewitnesses and a ton of secondary witnesses. So what does that mean? Well, it's not really good proof. I don't believe that. It's not enough. Well, let's look at sort of what the standard of ancient proof is, like, regarding history. Like, what have we got that proves other stuff in ancient history? And the one we're going to pick out is the life of Alexander the Great. Why Alexander the Great? Because Alexander the Great conquered the world, right? Like, Alexander the Great led an army out of Greece, and he went everywhere and conquered everything. He made it all the way to India and stopped. He was a major figure, and all of his generals, when he died, his generals broke up his empire, and they, started new empires, new little empires. And so all of history after Alexander is impacted by his life. Everybody spoke Greek because of Alexander. So Alexander the Great is a major world leader. He is one of the most important people in the ancient world as far as shaping history in the West. So, there must be dozens and hundreds of first-hand accounts of his life that we're able to open up and read about. And as a matter of fact, the number of primary source accounts for the life of Jesus is almost nothing. Like if you can walk into a museum and say that belongs, or this book was, or whatever, there are almost no surviving primary source accounts of the life of Alexander. And I'm going to go through these real quick because there's a lot of stuff to talk about here. But there are several inscriptions that are considered to be primary sources. And they're fragments of manuscripts, like little pieces, right? But there aren't any full manuscripts. So we don't have any primary sources. All of what we know about Alexander's life is from secondary sources. Now let's have a look at this. So the most influential source on the life of Jesus is a guy named Cleotarchus, who wrote a contemporary account of the invasions and the journeys of Alexander. He did not witness them. He based his work on secondary accounts of his life, but he was a contemporary. And his work is lost. So there's no copies of it existing. But, now watch this, Cleotarchus's work is picked up by a guy named Timagenes. And my pronunciation is wrong, I'm sorry. But Timagenes, he takes Cleotarchus's books and he bases his work on that, and he draws a whole lot of it into his work. And so we're able to say, this is what Cleotarchus's work is based on Timagenes's work, but it's lost too. So lost, and then the guy who wrote about it is lost. And then other people quoted Timagenes' work as it quoted Cleotarchus' work, and that's how we know most of what we know about the life of Alexander the Great. That's 3 or 4 generations removed, secondary sources. We don't doubt the life of Alexander the Great. We don't. We assume these things are true because that is a really strong bit of historical evidence. 3 or 4 generations removed. You say, well, he conquered the world. Well, Christians showed up, like there were believers. I mean, there is all kinds of proof in the life of Jesus that is, very straightforward and more well documented and right there compared to Alexander, who did conquer the world. And he's well documented. I'm not saying Alexander didn't exist. I'm saying when we talk about standard of proof, like you can't get around the fact that Jesus's life is incredibly well documented. So then we have Arian, who wrote about Alexander in like the 2nd century AD. Now, mind you, that the life of Alexander the Great was in 400-something BC. So this is 600 years later. Arian wrote about the life of Alexander 600 years later. He based his work on Ptolemy, and I know I'm pronouncing it wrong. I don't care. Ptolemy was one of Alexander's generals. So that is a primary source that a secondary source used to write about Alexander. Plutarch, 2nd century biography about Alexander's life. It's based on Aristobulus and Callisthenes, both of whom knew Alexander, and both of whose work is lost. And so in the 2nd century AD, Plutarch wrote about this life based on contemporary accounts from 600 years previously that are now lost. So we don't have the originals, but we have secondary sources based on the primary sources. Again, no primary sources. And I'm not saying Alexander didn't exist, because of course he existed. But for Jesus, we have 7 primary sources that are surviving. 7. And we have locations, and we have all kinds of secondary sources that are contemporary, not 4 centuries later, contemporary. We have Diodorus, who in the 1st century BC, so that's older, right? He wrote a book based on the life of Alexander. Like he talked about Alexander. Again, based on one of his generals, and a secondary source that was contemporary to the life of Alexander. Is the theme kind of showing up here yet? The 10-volume work written by Curtius was a history of Alexander's life. There are only 8 volumes that remain, but that's how we know about Timagenes, who, remember, wrote based on a secondary source that existed before him, who wrote based on primary sources from before him. And so that's several generations reviewed and not a complete work. Again, the book of John, the earliest fragment of John we have is from 70 AD, and John claims to be an eyewitness. And actually, we have people who knew John and talked about how he knew Jesus. We have other people who knew Jesus who wrote about John. John is a well-documented figure who is a primary source account. There are a few others. I'll flash them up on the screen. You can read about them. The long and short of it is that we have nothing that is a primary account of the life of Alexander. And Alexander's life happened, and we have a pretty good idea of what happened in it. But if we set the standard of evidence for the life of Jesus higher than what we have, we wipe out almost all of ancient history. We lose so much ancient history because the standard of proof required to prove historical events, true or not true, is so incredibly high that it's unattainable. Alexander the Great disappears from history as an unprovable mythological figure. He conquered the world. There's absolute proof. There are coins and inscriptions and all kinds of other stuff. But the life of Jesus is incredibly closely documented by primary and secondary sources. So when we say you cannot use the Bible to prove the Bible, is saying you cannot take 7 eyewitnesses and a couple of secondary sources who knew eyewitnesses personally. You can't take those things to prove the events of the life of Jesus. Except you can, because that's how history works. The Bible makes some pretty outstanding claims, some pretty big claims, but those pretty big claims are backed up by some pretty well documented evidence. Next week, we're going to talk about secondary sources, because there are secondary sources. There are contemporaries of Jesus who mention him. There are people who wrote about Jesus after the fact, early appearances of Christians, archaeology that supports it. The life of Christ is very, very well documented. And so when we say, oh, well, there's no proof for Jesus, there's a ton of proof. Well, the Bible doesn't count. Well, the Bible is a collection of all of the proof into a single book. And so, the Bible isn't a monolith. It's, the life of Jesus, 27 books written by guys who knew him. I know this is long, but this information, it's so interesting and it's so exciting. And it's really neat to understand these things. And so I was just going to go long. Next week, we'll talk about secondary sources that exist. Well, no, we'll bump that down the road 2 weeks. Next week, we'll talk about whether or not the eyewitness accounts of the apostles are believable. Because that's a whole thing. What if they lied? What if they were heading out to make $1 million or drachma or, ducats of silver or whatever? What if that was their goal? Why would they, of course they made it up so that they could become rich and famous. We're going to look at whether or not they lied. We're going to look at whether or not their statements are believable. And there's a lot of support for the fact that they told the truth. That'll be really fun. Again, I'm at 28 minutes, so I'm going to stop talking. If you've listened this long, you are better than me. I applaud you for your persistence. Thanks much. Have a good day. If you have questions, comments, complaints, opinions, reach out to me, comments, whatever. Again, this is Eric, Big Sandy Church of God. God bless. I'm enjoying teaching this. I hope you're enjoying learning about it.